Hello, it is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is New York City sociologist and journalist Tony Carnes. I got to know him when I lived there in the city for several years. He has a lot of fascinating insights into religion in cities, and in fact, he's the founder and editor of a great site called A Journey Through NYC Religions, which is a website dedicated to journalism about all things religion in New York. You can find it at nycreligion.info. I'm dropping a link to that in the show notes if you want to catch it there. It's a great site. I haven't seen anything quite like it in any other city. Tony, thank you for joining me today.
It's such a great pleasure to be with you, Aaron.
You said something once that really struck me. You said New York is America's first post-secular city. What do you mean by that?
Well, the post-secular term is not commonly used, coined by a sociologist, philosopher, Jürgen Habermas. But what it means is that we're not in secular city anymore. We're not even in Sodom and Gomorrah anymore here in New York. We've had so much religious growth in New York that you can't say that, oh, this is the secular city. As you know, in 1963, Harvey Cox published a famous book called The Secular City. And it wasn't specifically about New York, but many people applied it to New York, and New York was getting more and more secular. That is, what does it mean, secular? It means that religion is not seen as something that you talk about in public or that you use to guide your ideas about public policy or about life in the city. At the most, you can have a religion that's private. The public square is off limits. And furthermore, that religion is decreasing and declining and disappearing, maybe. And so the secular mentality, based on various, maybe reason or whatever, but not religious, is triumphant. And so to argue, to have good reasons for something, you can't invoke religious reasons. You can only invoke secular reasons. But that started to change because the secular city failed. It was a terrible disaster. It was certainly a disaster for the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, mainly churches and synagogues in New York at that time. They decreased so that by 1975, the New York Times ran a series of articles in August of that year saying the churches and the synagogues and other religious groups feel on the defensive, shrinking, and, woe is me. And it's true. The city was also in disaster since at least 65. And it was many places were burning down. So a lot of hundreds of synagogues left, for example, hundreds of synagogues left the South Bronx. There used to be a lot of synagogues in the Bronx. Now there's only, in the South Bronx, there's only the remnant of one, though there may be some new things going on today. But and then in the Riverdale section, there's some synagogues. That's a rich part of the Bronx. But they were retreating, and the churches were burning down and closing up. One pastor in Harlem said, when I take a collection plate, I keep a shotgun under the pulpit. And the police were, many of the police were corrupt or not effective, and the leadership that they were under was not very good. So that became, and people sort of adjusted that and says, well, New York's a tough, secular, gritty city, and we don't have any of this namby-pamby of the suburbs. And Times Square, we like it to where there are peep shows every other doorway. But the city was actually just burning down around them. One, as you know, there was a famous book called The Bronx is Burning. And that actually happened. But it was accompanied by a disastrous decline in the number of visibility of religion and religion sites in the city. And furthermore, the elite, who were somewhat insulated from the reality on the streets, like in the universities, were very secular. And there was a dissent magazine, a socialist magazine, published a special edition on New York City. It said, "What is the city?" And what's interesting about this sociological, psychological exploration of the city is they didn't mention religion at all. And that is the secular city. That didn't work out so well, and people started turning around looking, but they were resisted when they did that. But religion grew starting in 1978. That's the pivotal year. Where 50 years ago was 1975 when the New York Times article came back out. 1978, you started to see visibly changes. Not the city didn't see the changes, but statistically, you started to see the changes. Church planting for the first time went beyond replacement value. Up to that point, actually, the number of new churches opened couldn't keep up with the number of churches being closed. And so it was, churches were still being planted, but they just couldn't keep up, and the number of churches closing was really high. But in 1978, for the first time, you see a pop-up, 150% or more pop-up in the number of churches that were being formed. Now, nobody noticed this. It just because they were scattered all over the place. But as we collected data on every church in the city, we started looking at their founding dates, and you start to see a pop-up in 1978. Now, that started to affect, after some years, a decade, 2 decades more, started to affect that the city maybe is not so secular, but it's still secular. There's still secularists here, still people that dislike religion and declaim it, but it started to change, and it accelerated in 2000. And we started, I started to write on this, that the city was changing, and people would say, "Oh, that's not true. It's the malarkey." I started writing on it actually in the 90s, 1990, probably in the late 80s. I said there's a change going on, and I brought this to some Christian institutional leaders, and they said, "No, there's no churches in the city. There's no new churches." Well, it wasn't true then, but they didn't see the growth, and it was hard to see. So I asked people to come together to bring new Korean pastors together, and we met in a Korean church that they had just built. Something that the white evangelical and others, even Black and Latino evangelicals, really didn't know about, is all of a sudden, where are these new churches coming from? And there were other religions that were opening up too. The Hindus opened at Sarva Temple in Flushing, and the mosques, there was some mosques that were beginning to open. And it started to change. Well, but I couldn't seem to get attention of the city intellectual and political leaders. And so I started writing more popular. I was a sociologist by background, writing, doing reporting on these, and finally, and it started changing. You could tell that since 78 to 2000, there was a growth. In 2000 and after 9/11, there was even more growth. And it started, I thought, well, we need to push it through to show more visibility. It was sort of like, yeah, there are these new religious groups, but they're not all that important. See, it was a sort of a stepwise. And, they shouldn't have a say on where we go in the future. We shouldn't allow them to teach anything in our schools, and preschool should be secular, and after school programs should be secular. All across the board, it was a secular option that was preferred. But people started having a voice, and they started to come on gingerly to a public square. In Manhattan, well over, let's see, today, wow, almost all the great majority, 80% of the evangelical churches that were founded in Manhattan were founded after 2000. And I don't know, and that started to change, but it wasn't this. In some ways, it started to look like it's becoming a new Jerusalem. Or a new Mecca, because mosques were starting to growing, and the Orthodox Jews started to grow, but it wasn't quite that. They still faced opponents on the public square, but now grudgingly, in the 2000s, after 2000, they started to say, well, maybe we need the religious voice, maybe we have to accept the religious voice. But the religious thought, well, we're going to triumph and take over the city, and that didn't happen either. What you're left with is that both groups have legitimate options to enter the public square and are numerous enough to force that, but neither one can quite get the dictatorial advantage over the other, and that's the post-secular square. It's not the secular square anymore. Religious voices can be heard, and even religious reasons can be sometimes adduced. Politicians can invoke God in office, but it's not the New Jerusalem either. It is between the secularism, the secular city, and the New Jerusalem. It's that spot in between. Now, that leaves both sides rather frustrated. The seculars still believe, many, that we're the triumphant, and everybody should just shut up. The religious people should just get out of the way, and particularly we don't want any religion in government or public policy because, that's going to be the old medievalism. The religious want they want space. They want space, and they have to fight for it. And when they get it, they want to maintain it, but they don't quite have public policy, and the universities have very few conservative religious people, and for evangelicals have almost none. Because the discrimination is so high, but they get on the square, and some politicians started to notice, and you could see this in most vividly when a secular guy, Mayor Bill de Blasio, is running for mayor. He was the mayor right before Eric Adams. He was the mayor right after Bloomberg. Actually, you saw this in Bloomberg. Let me start with Bloomberg. Bloomberg was very secular, and he didn't particularly want the religious groups on the public square, but he did recognize.
He kicked them out of the churches from meeting, out of the schools. From meeting there, right, as I recall.
Yeah, on Christmas Eve and on Hanukkah Eve, he declared that religious groups, not just churches, but mainly churches, but there were synagogues and even some Muslim groups, could not rent public space in the public schools or on the off hours to hold religious meetings, worship meetings, and they couldn't use the community rooms, which were supposed to be open to everybody, according to federal law, in the housing projects for meetings. And he kicked them out right before Christmas and Hanukkah, and he said they don't belong there. And the evangelicals went to court, and they did all these demonstrations. There were not just evangelicals, the other religious groups joined in also, but the evangelicals, particularly in the boroughs, joined this, and they pushed through. And they wanted to say, no, you got to reverse this. Well, Bloomberg was just defensive, and he started to talk about, well, I'm not against God. There's no off limit. He made a famous speech in Staten Island. There is no part of New York that's off limits to the love of God, except the public schools and the community centers. Well, they went to court, and they had one political leader who wanted to become mayor, but his candidacy was languishing. He announced his candidacy in January, and it named Bill de Blasio. He was a city, I think, controller or something like that before he announced his candidacy. He had been close to Hillary Clinton and was her campaign manager at one point. And he decided that he would champion the religious groups meeting in the public schools and the community center. And all of a sudden, you started to get, his candidacy started to take hold. He got out in front. We took a famous picture, the Journey Through NYC Religions, took a famous picture of him marching at the head of the religious groups over the Brooklyn Bridge with a big chant, open our, I forgot what the slogan was, but, open our fairness for the churches and the public schools or something like that. And that went ricocheted all around all of these religious groups that were rising, that were in the millions. They supported him. And he got...
It's exactly the opposite of what the outside observer looks at New York and says, oh, de Blasio, some hard progressive that took over from the technocratic centrist Bloomberg, and therefore he must have been like very negative towards religion. But in fact, he was very religion positive, and the religious group supported him.
That's right. And he supported them. Once he got elected, he did two things for them. One, he said, as long as I'm mayor, you can meet in the public schools and the community centers. By the way, the head of the board of the housing authority, they had an emergency meeting, and they called me at about 8:30 at night and says, don't publish anything more about us. We're going to allow the church groups in. Don't put us in with the public schools anymore. And but they took Bloomberg to get in there, and yes. And what he did after he got elected, he did two things for them. One, he opened up the public schools and the community centers in the off hours. They're not teaching classes. He supported them in court. We did a pretty locally. We did a survey of the secular people like Bloomberg arguing says, well, if they see churches meeting in the public school, that seems like it means that people think that the city government endorses churches. Well, we decided, and they introduced that to court, federal court. So we decided to do a survey. We had a university provide us a bunch of kids, and we interviewed people walking by the public schools that had churches on Sunday morning, and asked everybody, it says, do you think this means that they endorse, the public schools are endorsing you going to church? And they said, no, they're just meeting there. So, the claim of the seculars was just sort of mythological, verbiage. And that survey, which was we did in the Manhattan and the Bronx, was introduced in court, and at that point, the cases started fall apart. But de Blasio also did one other thing. He said in pre-K, preschool, and after-school programs that the city's going to fund, because he wanted to do that churches can access the funds. Now, they can't teach religion. The part of the funds that they get is not for teaching a religion. It's for the food, it's for the curriculum, it's for hiring people to do the pre-K and so forth, and a portion of the rent. But they can access as long as they just not spending it, for Bibles and stuff. And those popped up all over the city, particularly among African American churches. People that went to them started opening up. So he built this network. But the problem is, of course, he was progressive and everything else, and his policies started to deteriorate the city. Don't put criminals in jail, let them go. Don't invest in infrastructure, invest in mental health. I think I forgot how much money. It was like $200 million he was going to vote for mental health programs and education in the boroughs, and his wife would run it, and that money sort of just disappeared. Nobody really knows how it was spent. Yeah. I think it was tried to build her a campaign to be mayor. Now,
you're digging up you're digging up some of the stuff I remember from when I was there, and is some of the craze. You could just see where things started going off the rails a little bit, and then
we started to experience the negative world. That is, the hostility of religion did grow in a certain way. De Blasio helped, which shows you progressives. This is not a progressive versus right issue, but too many people in his group ran to policies that they were opposed by the churches, and so there was also a growth in hostility. So it's a paradoxical situation.
Well, if you look at the numbers, I just want to get into one thing, because the number of people who are Christian or of other religions in New York is very high. When I lived there, this big evangelist, Luis Palau, did a huge, crusade. Maybe it's not the PC term anymore, but you could say like a Billy Graham style crusade in Central Park.
He called it a festival, if you remember. He changed the name to festival.
Yeah, and it was huge. It was packed. And the New York Times wrote an article about it where they said there were 1.4 million evangelical Christians in New York City. I think if you told people there were 1.4 million evangelicals in New York, they'd never believe you. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. The entire Louisville, Kentucky metro area is only 1.3 million people. So we're talking about something that's bigger than a major American city, even just evangelicals in New York. It seems very contrary to people's expectations.
Yes, that's right. And it shows that, and it's, what can we say about that? A lot of times that what is happening is so contrary to our expectation, we don't see it at first. And it takes a lot of work to be able to see what's going on. And of course, if you can get locked onto a fact too, that it makes you blind to other things. Franklin Graham, after 9/11, Franklin Graham came here and opened up a center to help the city. And he's done a really great job on that, and later on during COVID. But he told me, he says, well, we came here because there are no churches. So there needs to be a Christian presence here. And I said, well, that's not quite true. And he discovered, as did a lot of other people around the country, church leaders, there are churches in New York. We had one guy who's a very successful church here in the city, John Tyson.
Yeah, I had John Tyson on the podcast, so some of the people listening may remember that.
Yes, and he was one of those that he said, I came in to help evangelize the city, and I discovered there were a lot of churches here, and you could plant churches here. Mm-hmm. And he said, I've always wanted to come to New York, even when I lived in Australia. And now I could come here and plant a church.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw what Tim Keller was doing at Redeemer Presbyterian, which started in 1989. And he connected up with them and did come back up to plant a church. And after a few iterations, he hit on what he calls his church is called Trinity Grace. And it has grown. It's a very popular church. He has it's a very effective and he a pastor, and he also is very attuned to trends, not in a trendy way, but in a sense of what is the situation that we need to preach to. And he's done and he wrote a beautiful book. It was called Something Beautiful. I forgot the name of the book, but it was a really tremendous book, and which he, dealt with some of the pains of being in the city and how the gospel helps heal that pain. And he came because of that discovery, but it wasn't necessarily shared by a lot of people, and it took time to grow. And then, and the Times discovered it during the George W. Bush second campaign, 2004. I had done with A.R. Bernard, who, by the way, Reverend A.R. Bernard is the pastor and founder of the largest church in New York City, has 31,000 members out there in East New York, and a very a terrific pastor. And we surveyed pastors, about 900 pastors in New York City before the George W. Bush election. And we discovered that the pastors were shifting toward voting George W. Bush, a Republican. And I thought, this cannot. I was a little surprised, and so was Reverend Bernard, who's African American from Panama. And so I decided to test it out. And I went to a church in Harlem, Bethel Gospel Tabernacle, and to present there. And I knew to the congregation and to a group of pastors, and they invited some other African American pastors to come comment, including a pastor from Queens, who is the executive director of a church out there that's very, very large, and he's very democratic.
Mm-hmm.
And so and the audience was the pastor at Bethel was Democratic also, a very good pastor, but also Democratic. And I thought, well, this is going to be the Tiger's Den. And the audience is there, and the pastor's sitting on the front seat, and then the various other people on the panel, the comment were there. And so I presented, and I realized soon that we got it right, because the pastor from Reverend Floyd Flake's church.
Yeah, Allen AME, a huge, incredible story there. I mean,
yes,
it's an amazing church.
Well, his executive director, his operating officer, was very democratic. Floyd Flake was a little bit more of a blend of politics, but his executive director was a dyed in the wool. If it's Democratic and alive, I'll vote for it.
Yeah.
And he gets up and he makes his comments. I said, well, here it comes. I'm going to get blasted. And I wanted to hear the contrary view. That was the whole purpose of the meeting, in my sense, and Reverend Bernard's sense, because there's a lot of canny people in the pastor in the African American church. So definitely want to hear from them. And he said, well, I know a lot of damn fools, like you're talking about. And I thought, oh, we're right. And then the Times, I shared it with the New York Times editor, and I got no response from them before the election. Well, then after the election, George W. Bush won, and the Times, who were totally taken by surprise. They had a headline of the opponent winning. And called me. I was actually in Greenville, North Carolina, with Reverend Bernard at a meeting of African American pastors. And I get a call from the editor of the Times. She says, "I am so sorry we didn't run your survey. We didn't do any articles on it. I was in Michigan or wherever, and where it was an important, I guess, state. That was a swing state, and we were so busy, I just couldn't get to it. And I apologize and so forth. But we really would like to run maybe 9 articles on it now. Are you okay with that?" And I said, "Would you cooperate with that?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I hang up, and I'm around this big table at this African-American megachurch in Greenville, North Carolina. Greenville's in North Carolina or South Carolina?
I think it's in South Carolina.
Yeah. Okay. That's a New Yorker's view of the world. Yeah. Somewhere out there.
I think it is.
Yeah.
Never been there.
Yeah. Well, and all of a sudden, immediately, and they said, "Well, can we talk to any of these pastors? Can you put us in contact with them?" And so I turned to the group, and I said, "I've got a call from the Times. They'd like to talk to you about the election. And I give them your phone numbers?" And they said, "Yeah, go ahead." So I hung up, and I gave the numbers to them, and immediately the reporters started calling. The phones around the table started ringing. They were fast. The Times, they were totally wrong, but they are very, very good. They turned on a dime. It was amazing. And they ran the story and other things about evangelicals they discovered. And it changed the newsroom of the Times and other progressive papers in the city, magazines. They started to do a few more stories and a little bit more recognition. They started they were still secular, but and definitely liberal politically, but still they said, "Well, maybe we need to take a look at this," because it was a shock to them. It was a catastrophe. That is, they thought they were winning, and all of a sudden the same thing happened with the Trump's first election. They thought that Hillary would be Queen Hillary and would win, and they were really shocked. But those
even saw some similar reporting out of the Times after this most recent election. It's like, here's the maps of huge shifts towards Trump in the Bronx. Like, what's going on? It's like totally off of people.
Well, yeah, let's come up to we've been talking about a lot of history, and I don't know how much people are necessarily interested in that. Yes, the present. You can see how the city is divided in the Eric Adams election. He was elected in 2020. What was it? 2020 or so. Today is and he, in the Democratic primary, there was a 3-way split in the candidacy. Eric Adams, Kathy Garcia, and another candidate that appealed to the Catholic progressive, the Hispanic progressives. And Adams won the primary. And what's interesting is he beat Kathy Garcia and the other candidate in the Hispanic areas. He won the Black areas. He got a large vote from the Asian American areas. And there was also and he got the Hasidic vote, the Jewish vote in the Brooklyn. And the only people that voted for the Kathy Garcia was a managerial liberal like Bloomberg. She got Manhattan and the Park Slope, and the progressive candidate won one housing project in the Lower East Side, and that's about it. Uh, and it showed the city had changed. And Adams ran with really going out to all the churches and the religious groups. And he made Reverend Guilford Monrose his faith advisor in the city hall. And Adams has turned out to have, it hasn't been it's been a rough uh, administration because there's corruption charges and maybe the management's not always what it should be. But he is hoping that two people will save him. Now, Donald Trump maybe stop the investigations.
Mm-hmm.
And in the summer, he, with Guilford Monroe's arranging it, he did a tour, his faith tour of the city, which were rallies basically for his mayorship. Notice what the mayor is doing, a faith tour of the city so he can get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is, of course, the evangelicals and Pentecostals and the Hasidic Jews, it's sort of like Trump. There's many things they don't like about Adams. But on the other hand, he's for us.
Yeah.
It's a very similar situation. Now, so we'll see what happens. The other candidates that come forward so far, I probably don't resonate with the faith groups very much. And in fact, some of them, the more progressives and some of the secular liberals of them I don't think they really recognize the changed city. But they're running against a incumbent that's wounded, and so we'll see what happens. So now we've got Donald Trump. He goes and raises funds, and he raised more funds, more donors in the South Bronx, in Bronx, which is very Hispanic, than the Democrats did. Now that got eclipsed later on because his donations from the Bronx were small, church people, people like that. And the big donors, there were some union headquarters in the Bronx, and when their donations came in, they went to Biden. So it looks like Biden, outraised. But really, if you look at the numbers, for a while, Trump was doing better. And then he has a rally in the Bronx. People say, what? Are you crazy trying to have a rally in the Bronx while you're running for election? And, how you can't possibly win New York. And it turns out that in the city, he did not win the city. The city is so Democratic, but the shifts in the vote were significant. Asians shifted toward him all over the city. Hispanics shifted toward him. African Americans shifted toward him. Maybe the only ones that didn't shift toward him were among evangelicals are the white progressives, evangelicals, managerial evangelicals they didn't shift. But you know what? Their compadres in faith shifted over. Now, that didn't win Trump the city, but it was a big shift. It was a little, people were really caught by surprise. And that's the new situation. Now, we'll see. Maybe Trump will turn out to be like Eric Adams, be a wounded president. But I think the strength he has, he had one presidency that didn't end well. Now he's got a second, and he seems to have learned a lot.
It seems like from a New York perspective that these religious people are now so large in numbers that they're an electoral force that has to be reckoned with. Yeah. Certainly in city politics, and that even for people who may not, in their own kind of like natural inclination, be pro-religion, feel that they have to do something because otherwise it's gonna hurt them.
That's right. And that's why I call this a post-secular city. It's not the religious city yet, though the religions do have a lot of say. But the seculars are still fighting rearguard action. And, people for their own reasons, for their own reasoning, don't always come to a religious faith. And the secularism background, the universities are so as you know, the universities here, particularly Columbia University, has had tremendous divisions. And partly the problem was they were so secular, they couldn't see the role of religion in the Middle East and couldn't understand how you have to deal with a conflict like that. And we had a new president. She was
Yeah, and you do, just so people don't know, you kind of co-chair the seminar on contents and methods in religion at Columbia.
that's
there.
right,
So you have an affiliation there.
an affiliation. It's not a faculty appointment, but
Okay.
affiliation. And she was really actually pretty good, but she failed because, like some of the other Ivy League presidents, didn't navigate her way very well. But I believe that what I advised her was that she should have what we call in a journey called sympathetic objectivity. I think it's the right method for the post-secular square. Sympathetic objectivity is this. There's two types. The old journalism is based on objectivity and really based on skepticism. That investigative journalism is really the greatest journalism, and it sets the paradigm. We say that is such a negative relationship to people you're interviewing, that you basically approach people with skepticism and you call it objectivity. But, it's very distant. You basically start off with distrust. And people sense that. There was a guy at Stanford that studied, can people tell if you trust or distrust them, basically whether you're for or against them. And common people are pretty accurate about that, he found. That most people can tell if somebody is, not, there's harboring hostility or distance. And so journalists fool themselves to think that if they put a smile on their face, that people are going to trust them, because they've been experienced also too many disabuse of that idea. So sympathetic objectivity is this. Instead of starting with skepticism of objectivity as the peak, you start with sympathy and empathy first. That community journalism, building community, is more important than investigative journalism. It's doing journalism that builds the community. Now, that may include investigative journalism, but it's no longer the queen of journalism. You start off with sympathy and empathy. Empathy means, in my terms, empathy means that you understand the mind of the other person, how they see things, and how they feel about things. You really, you have empathetic understanding. I get you. This is what you're saying. That takes you so far, though. That doesn't mean that you're sympathetic to them. I get you, but, too bad for you. Sympathy is two types. One is sort of like pity. I really feel bad for you, and I want to do something about it. That means I not only understand you and your dilemma, but I want to help you heal your hurts. And that's sort of pity. That type of sympathy is pity. There's another type of sympathy, though. And this is the sympathy where we're sympathizers with a cause. It means some things you do as a political or a secular or a religious person are so interesting, so innovative, so creative that the rest of us ought to know about it so we can incorporate it in our life. It doesn't mean you agree with everything, but you like the Good Samaritan. Jesus said, look at the Samaritan. You know who? The Samaritan, the guy that's an idolater, the guy that says the Jews that go to Jerusalem are wrong, the guys that murder Jews that walk through their territory. The Jews of Judea, they're focused on Jerusalem. You should look at them to learn compassion. And the Jews in Jesus' time said, what are you talking about? Samaritans are idolaters. They practice a heretical form of Judaism. And when we go through their territory on the way to Jerusalem, they try to kill us and rob us. He said, no, look at some of the Samaritans. their compassion. But that type of sympathy is even your opponent, no matter how bad, has some things they do that the rest are actually pretty good. The rest of us could learn from. It takes a lot of mental, psychological strength to make that effort. Then that's the sympathy side and the empathy side. Then you look objectively because you've already made a connection. Look, I understand you. I'm for your hurts and pains, and I admire some things you do. Then you look and say, well, what does happen when they do these things? That's the empathy, the objectivity part. You've already established yourself with a connection, emotional and psychological connection. And they know that. Now you say, well, you say you've got the greatest youth group in the world, and I like some of the things you're doing. How many youth do you come? And maybe they're a great youth group at this church or Islamic masjid. Maybe they only have 4. And you report that. You don't go snarky and say, oh, they say this, but they only have 4. No, people can read that themselves. The point is not to attack, is to get objectivity. Now, let's say you go to a church and they say, we got the greatest youth group in the nation. And you should report this. You go there and there are 200 youth. You say, wow. But then you find out, you said, what are all those buses over there? Oh, you were not supposed to see that. Those are the buses that we brought all the youth from other churches. They were maybe not telling you the truth. Then you become skeptical and investigative. You count the number of buses. You count the number of seats. You count the number of students that came there and say, well, they claim they have 200 youth, but actually 196 of them came on the bus. And then you can get a little bit more hostile. But they already know that you hopefully you did a story early on that showed empathy and sympathy. They already know that didn't come at them with meanness. And their supporters will also know that because they'll see that you showed that. And as a result, even if you eventually have to resort to an objectivity they don't like, or a skepticism that is embarrassing, many people in the group will say, well, he's just reporting what he saw or she saw. And so in the post-secular era, we go to the opponent, let's say the progressive, and see them as hurting. They're bound to be hurting in some ways. Saying, how can we, and see their viewpoint. Sometimes their viewpoint makes sense. And then we try to do something about the hurting. We try to find something they're doing that's good. And then we bring to objectivity and sympathy. Well, I just suggested to the president, Shafiq at Columbia, that she do sympathetic objectivity. But she only did the empathy part. She did a listening tour of student groups, 100. I don't know the final count, but she went many, many meetings in the fall of 2023 and before Christmas. And, I'm hear you, I'm listening to you. But she didn't go to the next step, sympathy. Number one, she didn't take any advice from the students, the pro-Palestinian students. She didn't find one thing that they did that she would adopt in her own position. She didn't have to agree with them. She just needed to find some things. And furthermore, she didn't have the sympathy for the Palestinians that they were, maybe for whatever reason, they were suffering. She could have started a relief fund to help children, or have the Columbia Medical Center stand by on the border to treat people. She didn't do any acts of empathy. She did, but acts of sympathy, she did not. And then after that, she could be objective and even skeptical, but she didn't. And so the students that were opposing her said, you say you listened to us, but you didn't hear us at all. And they meant you didn't adapt anything that we say. and you didn't do anything about the suffering of the Palestinians. And they started becoming radicalized, and they took over a building, and she eventually lost her job because her empathy is not enough. Empathy, understanding the viewpoint of the other person and feeling the pain of the other person's not enough. You got to move through that process, the sympathy, and two types of sympathy, which is sort of one type of pity, a compassion, and also finding where you agree with somebody. Then you move to objectivity. You don't leave out that you got to objectively count that, the Palestinian Hamas attacked Israel and that the Israelis are suffering too. And also skepticism about claiming that Hamas, they did it because after 25 years of suffering, they could do no, what is it, from 48, more than 25 years, right. 50, whatever, 60 years, they couldn't help themselves. You have to have skepticism about that. But if you showed the other parts, you would get some listening and students. Well, what happened is the radicals now have radicalized so much, and and this is not a big conflict in America. It involves just a certain slice of students. But now that it's on the road to some sort of settlement, and people were turned off by the radicalness of the radicalization. One of the students who had been kicked off campus and didn't let back on, saying that he took back that he wanted to kill all Jews. Then once he back on campus, he said, "Well, I take that back. I was just setting under pressure."
Yeah, we're getting close to I think going to be the amount of time that we're going to have.
Okay.
So I love what you said there, because the sympathetic, empathetic objectivity is the ethos that you bring to A Journey Through New York City Religions and how you do your reporting there. And so, but I want to make sure we have time to talk about your site, because people need to check it out. And again, I am not aware of anything else like it in other cities. Look, maybe there's probably other cities with sites, but it's really interesting and unique. Tell people about A Journey Through New York City Religions and what you do with your journey methodology of reporting.
Well, we started in 2010 because I felt like the religious groups didn't have much voice in the current news media at that time, and they need more space to be real, to really represent the city. So what we did is we decided that we would journey down through every road, street, alleyway of New York, and actually stop at every religious site in New York City and interview people, take photos, find out what they're doing. And there's 6,400 miles about roads.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
Yeah, and we've been through thousands. Right now, I'll give you an example. Crown Heights, which is an African-American Caribbean area, we visited 355 religious sites in Crown Heights. It's not a particularly big community district in Brooklyn, but we visited 355 sites. We took photos. We did a number of stories. We don't do a story about every place, but I tell the reporters, if they find a story when they visit a site and it's really good, you can stay there and do the story. We went to Flushing. Flushing is in Queens and is one of the Chinatowns in New York City. And we visited 414 religious sites. 414. Wow. They have, I would say, the density in a place like Crown Heights and Flushing of religion far exceeds the density of religious sites in most of the United States. That is, if you count per 100,000 or per 1,000, how many religious sites there are. There are, in some parts of New York, not all parts, some parts of New York, they're 3 times more dense than the Bible Belt. And they are, and they're still opening. Now, COVID did do a number, but we stop. And furthermore, we stop cold. We just walk in. And we're asking the Muslim, we're asking the Hindu, we're asking the Christian, we're asking the Hasidic, let us in. And we practice sympathetic objectivity. People would say that's impossible. Give you an example. We walk in, we took out a group of Columbia students to train them in our sympathetic objectivity. Went down Bedford Avenue, one of the longest street in Brooklyn. And I drop off two reporters who were not Christians. One was Muslim with Hajib, and the other was sort of a more secular liberal Catholic, at a Pentecostal black church. And we walk in, and immediately one woman says, "Nope, you can't come in here." And I said, "Wait a moment." And the two students were ready to leave. And I said, "Wait a moment, we don't know who she is. See that woman coming out of the car and everybody's gathered around? I bet that's the mother of the pastor." So I went over her and I told her what we're doing, and says, "We really want to give you more face in the city because what you're doing here is really incredibly right in a really pretty rough area. You've got a flourishing church, and we'd like to report that." She said, "Sure, I'll tell my son to let you do whatever you want." So I leave them there, and because I had to go meet other students at other sites, and they brought a whole busload of students, and our reporters were strung out teaching each one how to do it. And I come back later to see how they're doing, and they're in the back, sort of sitting, and the photographer is sitting, taking from a chair in the back. I said, "What are you doing? You need to get right up there and talk to me." I said, "Well, they're doing church." I says, "Don't you see the people in the back, the leaders, they're talking to each other? Go back there and talk to them, interview them." Mm-hmm. And I says, "You, the photographer, you need to go right up to the pastor, right behind him, and start taking pictures." They said, "Oh, we can't do that." I said, "No, you got the church mother says you can go anywhere." So I leave, I come back, and lo and behold, I come back. The reporter with the hijab has all these church leaders in the back during the service, all talking to her, sitting in chairs in a circle. And the other reporter, the photographer, was even more bold than I thought. She was laying on the floor in front of the pastor so she could have really good shots. Right there in front of the pulpit. And I thought, well, no, she's going to be really pretty good. And she is pretty good. And works at a newspaper in Oregon now, or a TV station, I think. But that's sympathetic objectivity. We would get into places that were, there was one or two failures. I knocked on a Taliban church. There's a church that was dedicated supporting the Taliban and maybe more. And I knock in and it's locked. It's a steel door and they're locked, and they say, "Who's there?" I had been told by another imam that this was their church. And I said, "Well, I just want to do this." And they say, "Go away, go away." I said, "Wait a moment. Aren't you, do you really, is there anybody really there? Do you have any?" "Yeah, we have 24 people." Number. Number. And I said, "Well, all I'm interested in is where people are from and what was life like then." "Well, we're mainly from Harat." Now I actually know the whole political situation that they're in. Mm-hmm. So they never let me in. So that was a failure. But I did an interview through a steel door. That's probably the only place that happened. We go to a Hasidic place. The Hasidics have lots of important rules about not touching non-Jews, particularly during religious times. And I go through this one block in Bedford Avenue too. And there is one church almost every other building. I mean, it's unbelievable in the block. I actually need to count up because I think there were like 20 not churches, congregations, synagogues. I go to the last one and I am tired. I've been there for 2-3 hours and it's hard to get in. And there's a little kid watching me the whole time. And I come down the block. He said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, he says, He said, "You missed one." I said, what do you mean? I spent hours on this block going from place to place. You see the very first place you went by? You missed it. Go back. So I go back, and sure enough, there's a little sign on the door. There's a fence, there's a yard, and there's a little sign on the door that says synagogue, Beth, B-E-T-H, synagogue, house of God. So I knock, and nobody's there. And so I go back. I said, yeah, you're right, kid. He said, yeah, of course I'm right. And I said, but there was nobody there. He says, well, do you want to meet the rabbi? I said, oh, yeah? He said, he wasn't there. He's my father. So he drags me in to meet his father. His father's a little bit startled, but he loves his son. Mm-hmm. Everything I see is the love. He says, okay. And the kid explains to him in Yiddish what's going on. And we have reporters that speak many languages. And he said, he said, you need to go with me. So we go quickly. Yiddish rabbis love, Hasidic rabbis walk very quick because they say you go straight in the Lord with looking to the left and right.
Right,
so
right. And then when they turn, they got this like way of turning and things too. It's really interesting.
That's right. So I'm going with him and I say, where are we going? He says, we are giving everybody their hats because they reached age. And the chief rabbi is giving them the hats, and you're going to take pictures of it. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm now afraid I'm going to touch them and make unclean, and I'm going to, I am now very nervous. We get there, and he said, and I sort of hanging back. He says, come on. And he takes me up, and he puts me right next to the chief rabbi of the Satmar sect. He right next to the rabbi and says, you stand here, and every time he has a hat, you take a picture because you're going to take a picture of everybody. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm here right next to the chief rabbi, the Rebbe, who doesn't quite know who he was, but the other rabbi said he should be there and he's going to take pictures for us. So I spent all my time taking pictures of kids looking up, receiving their hat. It's wonderful pictures. And that was sympathetic objectivity. It's starting there with a child. Almost everywhere in the city, that's our response. Now, that doesn't mean I became a Hasidic Jew. It doesn't mean with the Muslim places I go, I necessarily become a Muslim. I am, in fact, if they ask me who I am, I'm open about my Christian faith because I want them to be open. I believe a reporter should be honest about who they are. Reporters always ask me, they say, don't tell you where you come from. I says, they have a right to ask. You don't have to tell them, but they're most interested often in converting you, or at least convincing you. And if you tell them that, you're going to get even more talk. You're going to need more access. So that's what we do at Journey. We've been at thousands. We've been in every alleyway, almost every alleyway, not complete. Almost every alleyway. Let me end with Jesus Auto Body Shop. We come out in the Bronx, and it is a very dark and dangerous area. And I see Jesus Auto Body Shop. I says, we got to stop here. And I had two young reporters with me, and they say, we're going to get mugged because it's where the auto body shops are. That it goes like a wasteland at night. But there was lights there. I said, no, you can wait in the car. And they went down low down the car so that people would know they were there. And I go in, and the guy opens the door and says, what do you want? He looks like a pretty tough fellow, and the guys behind him look pretty tough. And I told him what I'm doing. I'm really curious, Jesus Auto Body Shop. He says, well, when I was in prison, I saw Jesus. And he opened this auto body shop for me. And now I'm taking some of my fellow guys who are now out of prison. We have a Bible study tonight. Do you want to join? Oh my gosh. A light in the darkest alley of the Bronx at that time was a light of faith. And who would have ever known that it was there? All the way from Jesus Auto Body Shop to Blessed Pizza in Queens. You have all of these faith actions and works that you would not notice unless you went there. And we just want to take people with us to see what we see and experience. Because these are people that are putting their life on the line. They're putting everything out there. They've been moved deeply by the Spirit and by their faith, and they are reshaping the city alleyway by alleyway. They have reverses, but you know what? They have changed the city. There are so many ex-gang leaders who are pastors in the Bronx and northern Manhattan. They became often pastors back in the 70s and 80s. They are at least as responsible for the change in the city as the good policing we got under Giuliani. Certainly that was important. But these guys were there to support them. They were ex-gangsters. Yeah, we don't want us molesting our children and our neighbors. We know how it works. And right now, I've got a guy, Pastor Vega in East Harlem. He was an ex-gangster. He's created a church that's really good, associated with Times Square Church, which is a Pentecostal church in Manhattan. He's an incredible guy. He probably was a very effective gangster, a big drug dealer on the west side of Manhattan, became a believer in an incredible story. I mean, he wanted to run from Jesus and he locked the door. He got himself in solitary and he said Jesus appeared to him. And he said, get away from me, get away from me. I'm in solitary. You shouldn't be here. Wow. My gosh. These are stories of heroism, a faith-driven heroism, a spirit-driven heroism that are worthy of the Bible. And wow, we so get ennobled by hearing about those stories. Even if we might not be the same religion or this other religion, we see the power of them. There's a downside to things too, but the upside for the city has been really significant. And we want to tell that story sympathetically, empathetically, objective, and when necessary, skeptical. And that's what A Journey Through NYC Religions is about, is to give you that picture going down the street with us, going down the alleyway. Yeah, we do lots of counts. We do lots of, sort of big stories that, are more academic, more what they call, review stories or info stories, in-depth stories. But we don't want to miss, New York's known for its graffiti. The first graffiti guy was named Taki from a Greek Orthodox church. The first graffiti in New York, the modern graffiti movement, was Taki. I think it was 174 or something like that. That was his street. Right underneath his original graffiti, his friend, who was from a Pentecostal church, wrote maybe the second graffiti in the city. It was "Try God," written in the subway, not legally.
Let's not encourage that one too much.
Yeah, I know, but these kids at that time, they couldn't go to the police, they couldn't go to their parents, they weren't unprotected, so they tried to create their own world, and yeah, they created some of the chaos in the city. But even at the nadir, even at that point where the city was seeing this huge graffiti movement, which now is worldwide, for better or worse, and street art, started right at the start. There was the seed of faith. And so I'm honored to even walk in the shadow of many of these people. So
that's an incredible, those are incredible stories. And again, you got to check out A Journey Through NYC Religions. It's nycreligion.info. There's tons of great stuff on there. And again, I love the stories. I love what you do. There's nothing else like it. So many of these stories are incredible and would never see the light of day. It's a documentary of life in New York, if nothing else, that will be of use to historians, I think, at a future date. So
I got to tell you, we use you, Aaron Wren, your work, and we're so thankful for it.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And again, my guest today has been Tony Carnes, who's both a sociologist and a journalist in New York City, runs the great site, A Journey Through New York City Religions, definitely check out the show notes where I put a link to that site, nycreligion.info. Yeah, I'll talk to you in the next show.